everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. Working with hackers, a brief look at implementing vulnerability disclosure policies and bug bounties. Before we get started, just a quick note, please don't take any photos or videos. You can get access to my slides though on my website if you need a copy of any of those. Okay, so who am I? GlitchWitch, obviously not my real name, but a handle that I use to kind of preserve my privacy. I currently work as a freelance information security researcher, primarily doing penetration testing, managing bug bounties, and providing consulting services. You can learn more about that on my website as well. Over the past decade, I've worked in a wide, quite nervous. I've worked in a wide range of roles in a number of industries, and in my spare time, I do my own auto repairs and quite enjoy that. And yeah, fun fact, this is my first time presenting at a conference, so quite anxious, but thank you. Right, so today we're talking about vulnerability disclosure policies, but at the end of this talk, you should hopefully have a basic understanding of at least a few things, including why you should have a vulnerability disclosure policy, some best practices to follow when implementing a policy, some resources to help you get started, and we'll also briefly touch on the differences between bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure policies, some benefits of running a bug bounty, and how to prepare for launching a bug bounty. So what is a vulnerability disclosure policy? Often shorthand for VDP. A vulnerability disclosure policy is intended to give hackers and researchers clear guidelines for submitting potentially unknown and harmful security vulnerabilities to your organization. So good vulnerability disclosure policy will provide a clear path for external parties, such as hackers and researchers, to report issues to you. In doing so, we'll give clear guidelines for things such as what your scope is, things that they can be testing, and things they should avoid. Good VDP will also ensure legal safe harbor for both the program runners and researchers. And ultimately, a successful VDP will improve the overall security posture of your product or organization. So why do you need a vulnerability disclosure policy? If you have a publicly facing website or product, you probably should have a disclosure policy for a number of reasons. First off, as we all know, nothing's 100% secure. People will find bugs whether you want them to or not. When those bugs are found, having a vulnerability disclosure policy provides a clear path on how to handle them, which ultimately will lead to those bugs getting fixed quicker. And then that way, people like me don't have to go through LinkedIn and find the security officer and contact them directly. VDP will also encourage hackers to tell you about bugs, rather than just ignoring them, drop them as 0 days, sell them, or even exploit them for their own gain. And of course, a VDP will help quell fears from researchers like myself, who face legal threats and might be operating in sort of a gray area. This is kind of a big one, because oftentimes without a vulnerability disclosure policy, researchers can be operating outside of the law, or in violation of laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, where they might not actually have authorization to do that, but they're trying to be helpful. Now, a good vulnerability disclosure policy should include some key elements. First, you should have guidelines around communication, such as where to report bugs. This could be a contact form, or often it's security@yourcompany.tld. And if possible, you should include a PGP key or some other way to encrypt that data and get it to you securely. You should also include the expected response time. Ideally, you want to communicate with researchers as soon as they email you, typically within 48 hours, ideally, and then set yourself a deadline for when they should check back in if they haven't heard anything. You should also include expectations around what sort of information they should include in the report. This might, for example, ask them to include a proof of concept or an applicable CVE number. And acknowledgement. This will kind of lay out how you'll reward researchers. Oftentimes, just having a bullet point on your website saying this person found this vulnerability is more than enough and really helps researchers build resumes. Oh. Uh-oh. Everything's broken. Sorry about that. So a good vulnerability disclosure policy should include some key elements. First, there should be, this is where I was already at. Sorry about that. Now that we kind of understand why we need a vulnerability disclosure policy and what you should include in your policy, we can take a look at some of the resources to help get you started. The first one is the open source vulnerability disclosure framework by BugCrowd and CypherLaw. It was designed to help prepare organizations to work independently with security researchers. It offers sort of a set of boilerplate templates that you can quickly write out and publish to get your own policy going. This is one that I've seen used in a lot of places. The second one is disclose.io, which kind of works on, kind of builds off of the previous work. And again, it attempts to standardize best practices around safe harbor and good faith for security researchers. There's also a free ISO. Kind of gives guidelines for disclosures of vulnerabilities. It's about 42 pages, goes into great detail of pretty much all the things you might wonder. And of course, you can always look at other companies' vulnerability disclosure policies. Some examples I've included are Google's, Cloudflare's, and Dropbox's. Now that we understand what you need to successfully implement a vulnerability disclosure policy, we can take a look at some common pitfalls to avoid. The first set is around communication. Things like not having timely response can be detrimental to your program. Again, typically you'll want to have an initial response within a day or two. And again, kind of give a timeline for that further communication. There's been cases where I've seen where, not responding initially in the first 24 or 48 hours can actually anger some researchers that are maybe more gray hat. Well, they'll just drop the vulnerability as a 0-day right there and then. You also want to have a clear communication, internal communication and documentation path. So this will include making sure all the applicable teams are on kind of the same page and that you're properly triaging findings and documenting when you don't. In cases where you make business decisions to not fix an issue right away, it's very important to document why that happened to avoid any potential legal or regulatory issues. This kind of ties in with resources and staffing. Ideally, the team receiving the reports will have strong customer service skills. They're really building relationships with the community. And sometimes also, like, the people who are on the other end of the screen make a living off of this, so have some empathy. Another common pitfall is the inability for your team to actually validate and prioritize the findings. Again, having the right people taking in these reports can be very, very important. And of course, there's the inability to fix the bugs that are reported to you. This can have several consequences, not just for the obvious reasons of having unpatched vulnerabilities, but also legal problems too. For example, if a cyber incident occurs, and it leads to regulatory investigation or a lawsuit, and they see that you have a whole bunch of unpatched vulnerabilities, that could look like you're not taking security very seriously. Now you might be wondering, what about bug bounties? Bug bounties typically differ from vulnerability disclosure policies in a few ways. Bug bounties expand on your existing vulnerability disclosure policy by offering incentives and financial rewards to researchers who discover vulnerabilities within your products. Bug bounties are typically set up within your organization when your organization already has a good security posture. And of course, bug bounties aren't for everyone. Just because all the cool kids are doing it doesn't mean you need to implement one. Now, before you get started on launching a successful bug bounty program, you're going to want to have a few things. First, you want to have an existing vulnerability disclosure policy and a strong grasp on handling researcher submissions. Ideally, you'll have had this in place for some time, and will have worked out the kinks in properly handling submissions and getting them fixed. You also want to have a healthy budget for rewarding researchers and for paying your staff. Having an existing disclosure policy can actually help you kind of estimate what that budget will be. And of course, you want good security posture. As you hopefully know, a bug bounty is not a pen test. So ideally, you'll want to have done pen testing and security testing beforehand. Doing that will actually save you a lot of money when you launch the bug bounty. Now, before you launch a bug bounty, you also want to consider a few things. First off, rewards. How much will you reward researchers? Will you offer cash or swag, such as conference tickets or software licenses? If you're paying cash rewards, how much are you willing to pay? What are the bugs that are most valuable to you? Typically, one rule of thumb to follow is if you've made a code change, you should be paying. The other is platform. Where are you going to host your bug bounty? Are you going to host it yourself? Will you host it on a platform like HackerOne or BugCrowd? And will it be public or invite only? Now, if you are going to go with a platform, there's some pros and cons. Obviously, there's more than this, but these are a few. Pros, if you don't have a large financial team, often researchers are working in all kinds of countries, and you're going to have to deal with tax paperwork with them. So if you go with a platform, often that's handled for you. Managed bug bounties often also reduce the internal workload, so having someone else kind of verify and triage that for you will kind of save you a lot of time internally. And using a platform also gets you instant recognition and exposure, and kind of an immediate response in the hacker community. And of course, there's some cons. It might end up being more expensive. Most platforms charge at minimum about 20% of the payouts you offer. There's also the third-party responsibility, so it might not be in your risk appetite to have all of your vulnerability reports on an external platform. And often you'll get lots of submissions, not always high-quality ones as well, and so you might not be able to handle that immediately. In conclusion, vulnerability disclosure policies help overall security. They also encourage researchers to report findings they might not have. They take a lot of work to implement, but they're definitely worth it. And bug bounties aren't for everyone. And communication is key. And that's it. I'm done a little bit early, but coffee break's next. If you want to submit questions, you can submit them there, or you can come up and ask. Up to you.
Well, in your experience, how was the government relating to the situation? All of this stuff is coming up in context of security breaches and everything else. Like, are they getting better at it?
Specifically the government, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, how is the government kind of relating to all of this, and are they getting better? In my experience, most of the bug bounties that I've done and submitted to have been from the US government, and there actually is a lot of push, both from the FTC and another organization that have actually been pushing for more people to have vulnerability disclosure policies because they recognize the benefit. So definitely, over the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot more adoption, and there's been a lot more push to really see that happen. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the politics of the Canadian government in regards to this, but yeah.